When most people think about electric cars, they imagine something modern, futuristic, and very recent, a technology born in Silicon Valley, shaped by startups, billionaires, and climate urgency, a clean alternative created to fix the mistakes of the industrial age. In the popular narrative, electric vehicles are a breakthrough of the 21st century, a symbol of progress finally catching up with responsibility, and for many, that story begins with Tesla. But that version of history is not just incomplete, it is deeply misleading, because the electric car was not invented in our time, it did not emerge as a reaction to oil dependence, and it certainly was not the product of modern environmental awareness. The electric car existed more than a century ago, it competed directly with gasoline vehicles, and for a brief moment, it was actually winning. And then, almost without explanation, it vanished from the roads, from the market, and eventually from collective memory. At the turn of the 20th century, the world was standing at a technological crossroads. Cities were expanding rapidly, electricity was spreading through urban centers, and the idea of personal transportation was still new enough that no single solution had claimed dominance. Steam-powered vehicles had proven cumbersome and dangerous, gasoline engines were loud, unreliable, and physically demanding, and electric cars, surprisingly, offered something no other technology could at the time: quiet operation, no smoke, no manual cranking, and a level of comfort that made them especially popular among urban drivers and wealthy consumers. In fact, around 1900, electric vehicles accounted for a significant share of all cars on the road in the United States, especially in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, where short distances and access to electricity made them highly practical. This was not a fringe experiment, it was a serious contender for the future of transportation. Electric cars were seen as refined machines, often marketed toward professionals, doctors, and even women, because they were easier to operate and did not require physical strength to start. While gasoline cars demanded hand cranking, which frequently caused injuries, electric cars started instantly, moved smoothly, and produced none of the noise and vibration that people associated with mechanical danger. At that moment in history, the question was not whether electric vehicles could work, but whether they would win. And if you had asked an engineer, a city planner, or even an investor in 1900 which technology looked more promising, many would have pointed to electricity without hesitation. So how did we go from that reality to a world almost entirely dominated by internal combustion engines for more than a century? How did a technology that was cleaner, quieter, and already functional simply disappear? The common explanation is usually framed as a natural outcome of technological evolution, a story that claims gasoline engines became cheaper, more powerful, and more practical, while electric cars failed to keep up. But when you look closely at the historical record, that explanation starts to fall apart. What actually happened was not a fair competition between technologies, but a convergence of economic interests, infrastructure decisions, patent control, and corporate power that systematically favored oil-based transportation while quietly suffocating its electric rival. To understand this, we need to step away from the myth of inevitable progress and look at how technology really evolves, not in a vacuum, but inside political systems, financial incentives, and industrial alliances. The early 20th century was not just an era of invention, it was an era of consolidation, where massive industries were being built around energy, transportation, and manufacturing, and where the winners were not always the most elegant solutions, but the ones that aligned best with existing power structures. Oil companies, steel manufacturers, and engine producers had every reason to push gasoline vehicles forward, while electric cars, which relied on decentralized electricity grids and fewer consumable resources, posed a long-term threat to recurring profits. And this is where the story begins to shift from innovation to suppression, because electric vehicle technology did not simply stagnate, in many cases, it was actively sidelined. Battery research slowed, investment dried up, and promising designs were abandoned or absorbed by companies that had no intention of bringing them to market. Patents changed hands quietly, sometimes disappearing into corporate vaults, sometimes repurposed to prevent competitors from advancing. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the hidden side of technological history, this is a great moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because this pattern repeats itself far more often than most people realize. But this story is not just about a general trend or a faceless industry. It is also about individuals, inventors who believed electric vehicles represented a better future, and who paid a price for challenging the dominant model of their time. Some of these inventors were marginalized, some were financially ruined, and others simply vanished from public recognition, their contributions erased or minimized as history was rewritten. The phrase, silenced, is not always literal, but it is deeply accurate, because silence can be created by exclusion, by lack of funding, by legal pressure, and by the slow erasure of credit. One of the most important things to understand is that technological dominance often depends less on what works best and more on what integrates best with existing systems. Gasoline vehicles fit perfectly into an economy built on oil extraction, refining, transportation, and continuous consumption. They required constant fueling, regular maintenance, and a vast supporting infrastructure, all of which generated ongoing profit. Electric vehicles, on the other hand, threaten to simplify transportation, reduce dependency on consumable fuel, and shift power toward electrical utilities rather than oil barons. That alone was enough to make them inconvenient for the industries shaping policy and investment at the time. By the 1910s and 1920s, the narrative around cars had already begun to change. Gasoline engines were framed as symbols of freedom, power, and masculinity, while electric cars were increasingly portrayed as weak, limited, or outdated. Marketing played a crucial role in this transformation, shaping public perception as much as engineering did. At the same time, government spending on roads and infrastructure overwhelmingly favored gasoline vehicles, reinforcing a feedback loop where electric cars appeared impractical not because they inherently were, but because the system around them was designed to exclude them. This is a pattern we will see again and again as this story unfolds, because the disappearance of the electric car was not caused by a single event or a single villain, but by a network of decisions that all pointed in the same direction. And somewhere inside that network, there were inventors who knew the technology worked, who understood its potential, and who watched as it was pushed aside. Their names are rarely mentioned, their designs rarely shown, and their stories rarely told, which is exactly why this series exists. In the next part, we're going to zoom in on one of those figures, an inventor whose work on electric vehicles was not only ahead of its time, but deliberately obstructed, absorbed, and ultimately buried. We'll look at how his technology functioned, why it threatened existing industries, and what happened when innovation collided with entrenched power. If you want to keep going on this journey with us, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment with your thoughts so far, because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that the future we were promised may have already existed once before. To understand how electric vehicles were not only abandoned but actively suppressed, we need to focus on the people who tried to keep them alive when the rest of the world was moving in the opposite direction. History often celebrates inventors only when their ideas succeed within the dominant system, but it tends to forget those whose inventions threaten that system itself. One of those figures was Thomas Davenport, and later, more controversially and more dangerously to industrial interests, inventors like Ferdinand Porsche in his early career and engineers working on high-capacity batteries and hybrid electric drivetrains decades before the concept became fashionable again. But the most important thing to understand is that there wasn't just one inventor of the electric car, there was a lineage of innovation, and several of those innovators ran directly into economic walls they could not break through. By the late 19th century, electric motors were already well understood, and battery technology, while primitive by modern standards, was improving steadily. Engineers were experimenting with lead-acid batteries, regenerative braking, and even early forms of hybrid systems that combined electric motors with gasoline engines. In fact, one of the earliest hybrid cars was built in 1900 by Ferdinand Porsche himself, the Lohner Porsche Mixed, a vehicle that used electric-will hub motors powered by batteries and assisted by a gasoline engine acting as a generator. This design solved many of the problems that critics of electric vehicles complained about, including limited range and power, and it demonstrated clearly that electric propulsion was not only viable but adaptable. And yet, despite this breakthrough, the technology was not pursued aggressively, not scaled, and not supported in the way gasoline engines were. The reason for this becomes clearer when you look at who controlled the industrial ecosystem of the early 20th century. Oil companies were rapidly consolidating power, railroads were deeply invested in fossil fuel logistics, and emerging automotive giants like Ford were building production lines optimized for internal combustion engines. The famous Model T, often credited with democratizing the automobile, was not just a technological product, it was an industrial strategy. It relied on cheap gasoline, standardized parts, and massive volumes, all of which reinforced a petroleum-based economy. Electric cars, which were often more durable and required less maintenance, simply did not fit into that economic model. But while large manufacturers shifted toward gasoline, independent inventors continued to refine electric vehicle designs. Some worked on better batteries, others on lighter frames, and some on entirely new propulsion systems. These inventors were not just competing with gasoline engines, they were competing with an entire industrial alignment that had already decided which future it wanted. Funding became harder to secure, patents were challenged or quietly acquired, and public interest was gradually redirected through advertising and cultural messaging. This is an important moment to pause and recognize how innovation can be strangled without ever being openly banned. No law was passed outlawing electric cars, no public declaration was made, and yet the result was the same: disappearance. One particularly telling example involves battery technology. Battery research did not stop because it was impossible, it slowed because it was no longer profitable to pursue aggressively. Oil-based transportation created a recurring revenue stream that batteries threatened to disrupt. A durable battery that could last years without replacement was, from a business perspective, a problem, not a solution. This dynamic echoes across the entire history of suppressed technologies, where longevity and efficiency are framed as weaknesses rather than strengths. If this sounds familiar, it's because we still see versions of this logic today, and if you're noticing the pattern, this is a great moment to leave a comment and let us know what parallels you're seeing in modern tech. As the decades passed, electric vehicles became increasingly marginalized. By the 1930s, they were almost entirely gone from consumer markets, relegated to niche uses like forklifts, delivery vehicles, and industrial transport where their advantages could not be ignored. This shift is often presented as a natural outcome of consumer preference, but consumer preference itself had been carefully engineered. Roads were built for long-distance travel, gas stations spread rapidly, and electric infrastructure for vehicles was allowed to stagnate. Once again, the system created the conditions that justified its own dominance. What makes this story even more unsettling is that electric vehicles periodically resurfaced, only to be pushed back down again. During oil crises, wartime fuel shortages, and moments of environmental concern, electric cars briefly returned to public conversation. Each time, prototypes were shown, interest grew, and then something happened. Funding evaporated, regulatory support weakened, or major manufacturers announced projects that were quietly cancelled. These were not isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper resistance to change that threatened existing power structures. One of the clearest modern examples of this pattern occurred in the late 20th century with the development of advanced electric vehicles in California, particularly in response to emissions regulations. Automakers were forced to innovate, and the results were impressive. Electric cars with decent range, reliability, and user satisfaction entered the market, proving once again that the technology worked. And then, just as suddenly, they were recalled, dismantled, and destroyed. The official explanations varied, but the underlying message was consistent: electric vehicles were not allowed to succeed on their own terms. This is where the idea of the silenced inventor expands beyond a single person. It becomes a systemic phenomenon, where innovation that threatens entrenched industries is either absorbed, neutralized, or erased. Inventors lose control of their patents, engineers see their projects cancelled, and consumers are told that the technology simply isn't ready yet, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Silence, in this context, is not the absence of sound, but the absence of visibility, credit, and continuity. As we move forward in this series, we'll begin to focus more sharply on specific individuals and moments where this silencing became undeniable, where legal battles, corporate decisions, and political influence intersected in ways that are impossible to ignore. In the next part, we'll examine how patents were used not to promote innovation, but to contain it, and how ownership of ideas became one of the most powerful tools in shaping the future of transportation. If this story is making you rethink what you know about technological progress, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started, and drop a like if you want to see more deep dives like this one. By the time electric vehicles began disappearing from public roads, something far more powerful than engineering had taken control of the outcome, and that force was not innovation, but ownership. Patents, which are often presented as tools to protect inventors and encourage progress, played a very different role in the story of the electric car. Instead of enabling competition, they became instruments of containment, allowing large corporations to legally acquire ideas they had no intention of developing, only to ensure that no one else could. This is one of the least discussed but most decisive mechanisms through which electric vehicle technology was silenced, not by force, but by paperwork, contracts, and courts. In theory, a patent gives an inventor exclusive rights to profit from their creation for a limited time, rewarding creativity and risk. In practice, patents often favor those with the financial resources to acquire, defend, and strategically deploy them. Small inventors, independent engineers, and early electric vehicle pioneers rarely had the capital to fight prolonged legal battles, especially against oil-backed automotive giants. What frequently happened was simple and devastating. An inventor would register a breakthrough related to batteries, electric motors, or energy efficiency, and soon after, a larger entity would challenge the patent, offer a buyout under pressure, or bury the inventor in litigation until surrender became the only option. Once acquired, these patents didn't always lead to products. Many were shelved, never commercialized, and never improved upon. From a business standpoint, this made perfect sense. A disruptive technology that reduced fuel consumption or eliminated it entirely threatened the foundation of an industry built on extraction, refining, and continuous consumption. So instead of competing with electric vehicles, it was often easier to own their future on paper and quietly ensure that future never arrived. If you've ever wondered how innovation can slow down without any obvious resistance, this is how it happens, and if this realization hits a nerve, consider dropping a like on the video, because understanding this mechanism changes how you see modern technology debates as well. This strategy wasn't limited to electric drivetrains. Battery technology itself became a battlefield. Throughout the 20th century, researchers developed batteries with higher energy density, longer life cycles, and faster charging capabilities. Some of these advances were patented and then absorbed by conglomerates with close ties to oil, automotive manufacturing, or defense. In some cases, inventors reported being pressured to abandon their work or redirect it toward military or industrial applications rather than consumer transportation. The message was rarely explicit, but it was consistent: this technology will exist, but not where it disrupts the most profitable systems. What makes this even more troubling is how effectively the narrative was controlled. As electric cars faded from public view, history books and popular media reframed their disappearance as a failure of technology rather than a consequence of strategy. Gasoline engines were portrayed as the natural evolution of transportation, while electric vehicles were dismissed as quaint experiments that simply couldn't compete. This framing became self-reinforcing. Investors avoided electric projects, universities shifted research priorities, and governments aligned infrastructure spending with the assumption that internal combustion was the only viable path forward. Silence doesn't always require censorship, sometimes it only requires repetition. And yet, despite all this pressure, electric vehicle innovation never fully died. It survived in the margins, in labs, in prototypes, and in applications that could not be ignored, like submarines, industrial vehicles, and space exploration. These environments proved something crucial: electric propulsion was reliable, efficient, and scalable when properly supported. But because these successes occurred outside consumer markets, they were rarely used to challenge the dominant narrative. Instead, they existed as exceptions that quietly contradicted the story everyone had learned to accept. As decades passed, the gap between what was technically possible and what was commercially available continued to grow. This gap is one of the clearest signs that a technology is being restrained rather than failing. When engineers know something can work, but markets insist it cannot, the explanation is almost never purely technical. It is economic, political, and deeply structural. Electric vehicles were not just competing with gasoline cars, they were competing with an entire worldview built around oil dependence. This brings us back to the idea of the silenced inventor, not as a tragic lone genius, but as a symbol of a broader pattern. Many of these inventors did not disappear dramatically. They didn't all die mysteriously or vanish overnight. Most were simply pushed out of relevance. Their patents expired and used, their names faded from memory, and their contributions were reassigned to institutions or corporations that reshaped the narrative to suit their interests. Silence, in this sense, is not violent, but it is extremely effective. In the next part, we're going to examine one of the most striking modern echoes of this history, a moment when electric vehicles clearly proved themselves again, gained public support, and were then systematically removed from circulation. This case forces us to confront a difficult question: if electric cars have been viable for over a century, why do they keep needing to be reinvented? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment if you think we're seeing the same pattern repeat itself today, because the next chapter makes that parallel impossible to ignore. By the late 20th century, the idea that electric vehicles were impractical had become so deeply ingrained that few people questioned it anymore. Gasoline cars dominated the roads, oil shaped geopolitics, and the internal combustion engine was treated as an untouchable standard. But in the 1990s, something disrupted that assumption in a way that the industry did not expect. Environmental concerns were rising, air quality in major cities was becoming a political issue, and governments were beginning to introduce regulations that forced automakers to confront the pollution their products created. In California, this pressure took a concrete form through the zero-emission vehicle mandate, a policy that required large automakers to produce a certain percentage of vehicles with zero tailpipe emissions. For the first time in decades, electric vehicles were not just an experiment, they were a legal requirement. What followed was one of the most revealing episodes in the history of modern transportation. Automakers, facing regulatory pressure, invested serious resources into developing electric cars that could meet consumer expectations. These were not crude prototypes or science fair projects. They were fully functional vehicles with modern design, acceptable range for daily use, and overwhelmingly positive feedback from the people who drove them. One car, in particular, became a symbol of what electric vehicles could be when they were allowed to exist: General Motors EV1. It was sleek, quiet, fast for its time, and beloved by its users. Drivers didn't just like it, many of them genuinely loved it. The success of these vehicles presented a problem, not because the technology failed, but because it worked too well. Drivers reported low maintenance, smooth performance, and a sense of liberation from gas stations and engine repairs. Surveys showed high satisfaction rates, and waiting lists formed for leases. This directly contradicted the long-standing narrative that electric cars were inconvenient or undesirable. And yet, despite this success, something strange happened. Instead of expanding the program, improving the technology, or selling the vehicles outright, manufacturers began to pull back. Leases were not renewed, production was halted, and eventually, the cars were recalled. The official explanations varied. Automakers claimed the vehicles were too expensive to maintain, that consumer demand was insufficient, or that battery technology was not ready for mass adoption. But these claims collapsed under scrutiny. Demand existed, users were begging to keep their cars, and the technology had already proven itself in real-world conditions. What became impossible to ignore was that the decision to end these programs was not driven by engineering limitations, but by strategic considerations. Electric vehicles, once again, threatened to disrupt a system that was deeply profitable and politically entrenched. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this episode was what happened next. Instead of storing the vehicles, selling them, or donating them for further research, many of these electric cars were deliberately destroyed. Perfectly functional vehicles were crushed, shredded, and erased from existence. This was not done quietly. Activists protested, drivers chained themselves to cars, and documentaries were made about the event. The image of electric vehicles being physically destroyed became a powerful symbol of how far institutions were willing to go to prevent a shift in transportation paradigms. This moment is crucial because it removes plausible deniability. It is one thing to argue that a technology failed naturally, it is another to destroy working examples of it. The destruction of these vehicles echoed the earlier silencing of electric car inventors, but in a far more visible and undeniable way. It showed that when electric vehicles re-emerged with enough momentum to challenge the status quo, the response was not competition, but elimination. The role of patents and intellectual property became central once again. Automakers retained control over the technology, the designs, and the software, preventing independent development or third-party support. Because many of these cars were leased rather than sold, manufacturers maintained legal authority over their fate. This legal framework allowed them to reclaim and destroy the vehicles without technically violating consumer rights. It was a masterclass in how legal structures can be used to control outcomes while maintaining the appearance of compliance. For many observers, this episode raised uncomfortable questions. If electric vehicles were truly unviable, why go to such lengths to erase them? Why not let them fail publicly? Why not sell them cheaply and let the market decide? The answer, for many, lies in the threat these vehicles pose to existing business models. A car that requires less maintenance, fewer replacement parts, and no gasoline fundamentally changes the economics of the automotive industry. It shifts value away from fuel, repairs, and consumables, and toward durability and efficiency. That shift was, and still is, deeply disruptive. This story also highlights how easily public memory can be shaped. Despite the visibility of these events at the time, they faded quickly from mainstream discourse. The narrative moved on, electric vehicles disappeared once again, and the idea that they were a recent invention resurfaced in the 2010s as if nothing had happened before. If you're finding this history as unsettling as it is fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding what happened here is key to understanding the present. In the next part, we're going to connect these historical patterns to the modern resurgence of electric vehicles and ask a difficult question: are today's electric cars a genuine break from the past, or are they being shaped by the same forces that silenced their predecessors? Stay with us, because the answer isn't as simple or as comforting as it might seem. When electric vehicles returned to mainstream conversation in the early 21st century, they were presented as something entirely new, almost as if the idea had just been discovered. The narrative was carefully framed around innovation, disruption, and a clean break from the past. This time, we were told, things would be different. Batteries had improved, computing power had exploded, and environmental awareness had finally caught up with technological capability. And at the center of this story stood a new symbol, a charismatic figure who would become inseparable from the modern electric car, Elon Musk. To many, this marked the triumphant return of a technology whose time had finally arrived. But when you look at this resurgence through the lens of history, a more complicated picture begins to emerge. Tesla did not invent the electric car. It did not invent lithium-ion batteries, electric motors, or regenerative braking. What it did, very effectively, was repackage existing technologies into a compelling product and align that product with powerful narratives about the future. Tesla entered the market at a moment when electric vehicles were no longer an existential threat to the oil economy, but a manageable transition that could be shaped, regulated, and integrated into existing power structures. This distinction is critical. The electric cars of the early 20th century threatened to replace gasoline vehicles entirely before the system around oil had fully matured. Modern electric cars, by contrast, are emerging in a world where oil has already extracted immense value, built global infrastructure, and entrenched itself deeply into politics and finance. This time, the transition could be controlled. Modern electric vehicles rely on rare earth minerals, complex global supply chains, centralized manufacturing, proprietary software, and digital ecosystems that lock users into long-term relationships with manufacturers. These cars are not just machines, they are platforms. Software updates, subscription features, data collection, and centralized charging networks all ensure that control remains firmly in corporate hands. In many ways, this makes modern electric vehicles far more compatible with existing capitalist structures than their early predecessors ever were. They do not threaten consumption, they redefine it. This helps explain why electric vehicles are now being embraced by major automakers and oil-adjacent industries rather than resisted outright. Oil companies invest in charging infrastructure. Automotive giants pivot their marketing toward electrification. Governments subsidize purchases while maintaining energy systems that still rely heavily on fossil fuels. The electric car is no longer positioned as an alternative to the system, but as an evolution within it. And while this shift brings undeniable benefits, it also raises an uncomfortable question: is this the electric future that was once suppressed, or a safer, more controllable version of it? One of the most striking differences between early electric vehicles and modern ones is ownership. Early electric cars were simple by design. They could be repaired locally, modified, and maintained without specialized software or corporate approval. Modern electric vehicles, on the other hand, are increasingly locked down. Repairs often require proprietary tools, batteries are sealed and difficult to replace, and software governs everything from performance to access. This level of control ensures that while the vehicle may be electric, the power dynamic remains centralized. This brings us back to the idea of the silenced inventor. The inventors of early electric vehicles imagined a future where transportation was simpler, cleaner, and less dependent on complex supply chains. That vision conflicted with industries built on recurring revenue, scarcity, and control. Today's electric vehicles, while technologically impressive, align far more closely with those industries' needs. They reduce emissions, but they do not reduce dependency. They shift the source of energy, but they do not fundamentally challenge who controls it. None of this means that modern electric vehicles are a lie or a failure. They are real, effective, and in many ways necessary. But they are also a reminder that technology does not re-emerge in a vacuum. It returns shaped by the forces that once suppressed it. The electric car was not resurrected because it suddenly became viable, it was resurrected because it became acceptable. This reframing helps explain why the history of early electric vehicles is still rarely discussed. If people understood that electric cars were viable more than a century ago, it would raise uncomfortable questions about what else might have been delayed, redirected, or erased. It would challenge the comforting belief that progress is always linear and benevolent. And it would force us to confront the reality that innovation is often less about discovery and more about permission. As we approach the end of this series, the question becomes less about blame and more about awareness. The inventors who were silenced may never receive the recognition they deserve, but their stories offer something just as valuable, a lens through which to evaluate the future. When new technologies emerge, we can ask not only whether they work, but who benefits from their adoption, who controls their evolution, and what alternatives might be quietly disappearing as a result. In the final part, we're going to step back and connect everything we've discussed into a single, unsettling realization about how history remembers innovation, and how easily the future can be rewritten. If this series has changed the way you see electric vehicles, technology, or progress itself, make sure you're subscribed, leave a comment with your take, and stay with us for the conclusion, because the last chapter brings this entire story full circle. When we look back at the story of the electric car, what becomes clear is that its disappearance was never about failure, and its return was never about discovery. The technology did not vanish because it was impossible, and it did not come back because it was finally invented. It disappeared because it challenged the wrong interests at the wrong time, and it returned only when it could be shaped, contained, and monetized within an already established system. This realization forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how progress actually works, because history does not move forward simply by adopting the best ideas, it moves forward by selecting the ideas that fit power, profit, and control. The early inventors of electric vehicles were not naive dreamers. They were engineers, tinkerers, and industrial thinkers who understood efficiency, durability, and practicality. They imagined a future where transportation was quieter, cleaner, and less dependent on constant resource extraction. What they underestimated was not physics or engineering, but politics and economics. They built machines, but they were up against systems. And systems, once entrenched, do not yield easily to disruption, especially when that disruption threatens entire industries built around consumption rather than longevity. This is why the phrase, "the inventor who was silenced," matters, even if there was no single voice that was literally muted. Silence can be manufactured structurally. It can be created through lack of funding, hostile patent environments, controlled narratives, and infrastructure decisions that quietly make certain paths impossible. The electric car was silenced not by banning it, but by making everything around it hostile to its survival. Roads favored gasoline vehicles, research funding followed oil, public perception was shaped by marketing, and legal frameworks ensured that ownership of innovation rested with those least interested in deploying it. And when electric vehicles did resurface, again and again, they were treated as anomalies rather than continuations. Each resurgence was framed as a brand new beginning, disconnected from the past, stripped of its historical context. This wasn't accidental. Forgetting is convenient. Forgetting allows industries to present themselves as progressive without accounting for the delays they helped create. Forgetting turns suppression into inevitability, and delay into destiny. Modern electric vehicles exist in a carefully negotiated space. They offer real environmental benefits, genuine technological advancements, and meaningful improvements over internal combustion engines. But they also exist within boundaries. They are proprietary, software-locked, dependent on complex global supply chains, and deeply integrated into corporate ecosystems. They do not represent the liberation that early electric vehicle inventors imagined, but rather a compromise that makes electrification compatible with centralized control. That does not make them evil or fraudulent, but it does make them incomplete. The real lesson of this story is not that electric vehicles were stolen from us, but that the future itself is negotiable. Technologies do not succeed or fail solely based on merit. They succeed when they align with power. They fail when they threaten it. And sometimes, they are allowed to exist only after being reshaped into something less disruptive. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it, not just in transportation, but in energy, medicine, communication, and computing. This is why remembering the silenced inventors matters. Not because we can undo the past, but because it sharpens our ability to question the present. When a new technology is declared impossible, premature, or unrealistic, the question should never stop at, does it work, but should extend to, who loses if it does. When innovation is delayed, redirected, or suddenly reappears decades later as a breakthrough, history often holds the missing pieces. The electric car was not ahead of its time. It was inconvenient to its time. And that distinction changes everything. If this story made you rethink what you know about progress, innovation, and the stories we're told about technology, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your perspective, because Patent Wars exists to explore exactly these hidden fault lines between invention and power. The past is full of futures that almost happened, and the more we understand why they didn't, the better equipped we are to recognize the ones being negotiated right now. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act isn't inventing something new, but remembering what was never allowed to succeed.